The morning my son showed up with a placement coordinator from Birchwood Commons Assisted Living, I was in my workshop, behind the house, running a hand plane along a board of cherry wood. The radio was playing low. Outside, a heron I had come to think of as a permanent fixture was working the shallows at the edge of the property. I had not called Birchwood Commons. I had not toured it, requested information about it, or given anyone any reason to believe I had the slightest interest in an assisted living facility in Brentwood, Tennessee. But there was a white cargo van parked in my driveway, and there was my son at my workshop door, beside a woman I had never met wearing a navy lanyard and holding a glossy folder. And his face had the particular set to it of a man who has already made a decision and is now managing the presentation. I set the hand plane on the workbench. I walked to the door. I asked the woman to come in. She introduced herself as a placement coordinator. She was there to discuss a range of options at Birchwood Commons. She mentioned amenities. She mentioned activities. She used the phrase seamless transition twice. My son stood behind her with his arms folded and occasionally nodded. I let her finish. Then I asked my son one question. "When did you schedule this?" He said that wasn't exactly the right framing. I said it was the only framing I had, since I had scheduled nothing. He said they were exploring options together as a family. I asked whose options, since I was the family member under discussion and had not been consulted. He looked at the coordinator. She looked at her folder. I asked her to wait by her van. She went. I looked at my son and told him that whatever he thought this morning was going to accomplish, he needed to reconsider. He said he was worried about me. He said I hadn't been myself since his mother passed. I told him that was true, and also that it was not a clinical finding. He left before noon. The coordinator's van went with him. I stood in my driveway until both were out of sight. Then I went back inside and picked up the hand plane and held it for a while without using it. Before I go any further, let me tell you who I am. My name is Burton Hale. I spent 26 years as a circuit court judge in Davidson County, Tennessee. Before that, 12 years as a deputy district attorney. Before that, 3 years in the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps. The law has been the structural frame of my adult life, which means I spent nearly 4 decades in rooms with people who believed they were presenting one story while actually telling another. You develop a sensitivity to the gap between those two things that doesn't retire when you do. My wife Florence died 2.5 years ago. We had 34 years together. She was an English teacher who corrected my sentence constructions until the week she was too tired to do it, and who spent the last 18 months of her life reading every novel she hadn't gotten to. I retired from the bench 6 months after she passed, sold the house in Bellevue, and moved to the lake house on Percy's Priest Lake that we had been planning to retire to together. It had a dock she never sat on, and a woodworking shop I built in the back with materials she helped me order. The rocking chair was her design. She had sketched it in a project notebook 2 years before her diagnosis, a low-slung cherry chair with wide armrests meant for the porch facing the water. She wanted to watch the herons come in at dusk. I've been building it since the month after her funeral. It takes longer than she would have expected. She would have had something to say about that. My son Weston is 38. He married a woman named Ingrid 7 years ago. She is methodical and precise in a way I had always read as competence and now understand differently. After Florence died, the two of them began coming around more frequently. I was grateful. Grief makes you grateful for attention in ways you wouldn't be otherwise, and I did not look as carefully as I should have at what kind of attention it was. Ingrid had a habit of asking questions in passing that sounded like concern but added up to an inventory. What had the property last appraised for? Whether Florence and I had updated our beneficiary designations. Whether I had done any Medicaid planning. She said she wanted to make sure everything was in order for me. She arrived for 4 separate visits over 8 months, with folders she described as routine estate updates. Spreading papers on my kitchen table with the casual efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the movement, directing my attention elsewhere while I found the signature lines. I signed. I trusted my son's wife the way you trust someone who has sat at your Thanksgiving table for 7 years, and that trust made me careless in a way that had nothing to do with cognitive decline. Weston wandered the house during those visits. He stood in the kitchen and commented on the countertops. He stepped onto the dock and looked up the shoreline with a quiet, measuring expression. He asked me once, conversationally, whether I had any idea what waterfront property was moving for on this stretch of the lake. I said I hadn't thought about it. He nodded and changed the subject. I noticed all of it. I dismissed all of it. That was my error, and I've sat with it longer than I care to admit. The afternoon my son left with the placement coordinator, I called the person I trusted most among everyone still living. A woman named Rowena, who had clerked for me in my third year on the bench and was now a partner at an elder law firm in Nashville. We had stayed in close contact for 15 years. She was the person I called when something required thinking out loud with someone who would not soften what needed to be said. I told her everything: the folders, the signatures, the questions about property values, the van in my driveway. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if I still had copies of what I had signed. I did. I kept everything. 26 years on the bench teaches you not to discard paper. Bring them tomorrow morning, she said, and don't sign anything before we've talked. I was in her office at 8:30 the next day. She read through the documents in the order I had received them and said nothing until she reached the third page of the fourth one. Then she set it down and looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. "Burton," she said, "this is a durable medical power of attorney. It designates Weston as your healthcare proxy with full authority to make placement decisions in the event of documented cognitive impairment." "I know what a durable POA is," I said. "I know you do. What I'm asking is whether you understood that's what you were signing when Ingrid put it in front of you." I hadn't. I had believed it was a healthcare directive revision, a routine document alongside a revised living will. Ingrid had been talking about something unrelated when I reached that signature line. She had been counting on the fact that a man who had just buried his wife would not read every page of a stack of papers his daughter-in-law called standard housekeeping. She was right. That was the thing I could not stop returning to. Then Rowena told me something that changed the temperature of the room. The previous morning, before my arrival, she had received a call from a colleague who handled guardianship proceedings. That colleague had fielded an inquiry from an attorney named Sims about the timeline for establishing emergency guardianship in Tennessee for an elderly client with documented cognitive decline. The name attached to the intake file, which her colleague had briefly seen before the inquiry, was abruptly withdrawn. Was mine. Someone had already been building the next step. Rowena gave me two names. The first was Dr. Pamela Norris, a forensic psychiatrist at Vanderbilt who specialized in contested competency evaluations. The second was Mona Chiswick, a former Tennessee Department of Revenue special agent who now took private financial fraud cases. "Call both of them today," Rowena said, "and before you touch a pen to anything for any reason, you call me first." Mona Chiswick met me that afternoon at a coffee shop near Donelson. She was 63, compact and unhurried, with the contained patience of someone trained to read documents that don't want to be understood. She listened without interrupting while I laid out the full timeline. When I finished, she said, "Send me your account credentials and property records tonight. Give me 48 hours. She called on the third morning. "Burton," she said, "I need you to sit down." I was already sitting, I told her. 4 months ago, she said, an LLC was registered with the Tennessee Secretary of State. The registered agent is Ingrid Hale. The company is called Lakeside Asset Management Group, LLC. Its operating agreement references a pending residential property transaction valued between $850,000 and $950,000. The legal description matches your parcel on Percy Priest Lake. I set my coffee cup down carefully. "There's more," she said. "6 weeks ago, a mail forwarding request was filed from your address. Your brokerage statements, property tax notices, and Medicare correspondence are currently being redirected to a P.O. box in Brentwood, registered to Weston Hale. You have not been receiving your own financial mail for a month and a half." I said nothing. 3 weeks ago, she continued, someone using a device registered to Ingrid contacted a residential brokerage in Brentwood. They asked about listing a waterfront property on Percy Priest Lake and specifically requested whether the brokerage had experience with court-authorized sales of properties held in guardianship arrangements. "Court-authorized," I said. "Court-authorized," she said. "They were planning for a legal stage you had not yet reached, which means they expected you would reach it." I thought about Weston standing on my dock looking up the shoreline. I thought about Ingrid sliding documents across my kitchen table while she talked about something else. I thought about Florence's rocking chair sitting unfinished at the back of the shop, and what would have happened to it if this had gone another way. "What is the property worth?" I asked. Current comparables put it between $875,000 and $950,000, depending on the dock and lot size. "Mona," I said, "how much does Ingrid know about Weston's debt position?" "Her name is on both private investor agreements as a cosigner. She received a copy of the demand letter. She is not a bystander." I thanked her and hung up and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes without starting the car. The picture had come together the way it always does once you have enough data points. Weston had invested substantially in a restaurant franchise group that had expanded past its capacity and was now in default. The SBA loan he had used to finance his stake was one problem. The two private investors were another, and they were the more serious one. He owed approximately $490,000 with 60 days before personal guarantee liability attached. The lake house, paid off, waterfront, appraising near $1 million, was the only asset large enough to cover it. Move me to Birchwood Commons. Establish guardianship through whatever medical documentation they were in the process of fabricating. Assume control of my finances through the POA already in place. Sell the property through the LLC Ingrid had already incorporated. Settle the debt. Disappear into something new. It was a clean scheme. It required one thing they had not accounted for: that the person they were planning around had spent 26 years evaluating exactly this kind of paperwork. Rowena filed two simultaneous motions. The first challenged and sought revocation of the durable POA on the grounds that it had been obtained through deception. The second was a civil injunction blocking any transfer or encumbrance of the lake house, pending resolution of the matter. The 2 days after filing were instructive. Weston called 3 times. He left one voicemail that had the tight, rehearsed quality of something composed with an attorney present. He hoped we could clear this up before it became something that couldn't be undone. There had been a misunderstanding. He cared about me and only wanted what was best. I forwarded it to Rowena without responding. The discovery materials arrived 2 weeks later. Among them was a year-long text thread between Weston and Ingrid that Rowena had obtained through the civil process. She shared them with me the evening before the hearing. I sat at my kitchen table and read through them with the same attention I had once given case files that a verdict depended on. Ingrid had initiated the conversation 11 months earlier, 2 months after Florence's funeral. She had researched Tennessee guardianship statute. She had estimated the lake house value using county assessment records. She had mapped out the sequence: POA first, medical documentation second, guardianship filing third, property transfer through the LLC fourth. She had written to Weston, "The house covers everything, and if we handle the POA correctly, he won't resist it because he won't understand what he's signing. He won't understand what he's signing." Weston had expressed hesitation at one point. He wrote that it didn't feel right. Ingrid responded in 4 sentences. They had 60 days before the investors came after his personal assets. Her parents could not help them. The alternatives were worse. And then, "He's not going to know the difference once he's settled somewhere with structured care. This is the only way through. He's not going to know the difference." I read those words 3 times. I set the phone face down on the table. I looked out the window at the lake for a long time, at the lights on the far bank moving in the surface of the water. What I felt sitting there was not what I would call anger. Anger is acute and fast, and I know its temperature because I watched it on people's faces in my courtroom for a quarter century. What I felt was older and quieter than that, a grief with a new layer to it I hadn't found before. Grief for a version of my son I had believed in longer than the evidence had warranted. The anger and the grief were moving through me at different speeds, and neither had fully resolved by the time I finally went to bed. The civil hearing ran 2 hours and 40 minutes. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Rowena and watched the attorney Weston and Ingrid had retained. A man named Sims attempt the standard recasting, frame the adult children as worried caregivers, the resisting parent as confused, the legal proceedings as collateral to genuine family concern. He used the word safety repeatedly. He submitted photographs. Weston and me at a fishing trip years ago, at Florence's memorial, at a birthday dinner where we were both smiling. Then Rowena presented what we had. The text thread in full. Mona's financial findings, the LLC, the mail diversion, the real estate inquiry, requesting a guardianship authorized sale. A sworn affidavit from my primary care physician at Vanderbilt confirming that my most recent annual physical had shown no indicators of cognitive impairment. An affidavit from the geriatric specialist named on the fraudulent medical letter confirming he had never met me, never evaluated me, and that correspondence bearing his letterhead had been reproduced without his authorization. A fact he had since reported to the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners. It turned out that among the documents Ingrid had placed in front of me was an authorization form that had been repurposed to generate a letter, suggesting I had undergone a competency evaluation I had never received. The doctor named on that letter was cooperating fully. He was, by all accounts, furious. Judge Alderman read the text messages without expression. When she reached the section where Ingrid laid out the operational sequence in specific terms, something shifted in her posture. It was a small change. I had watched enough judges to know what it meant. She set the documents down. The medical power of attorney is revoked in its entirety, she said. The fraudulent medical correspondence is stricken from any legal record. Any guardianship proceeding predicated on these materials is void. The property at 4814 Lake Crest Point remains fully in the name of Burton Hale. She turned to the defense table. Counsel, the conduct documented here goes substantially beyond a family dispute. I am referring all materials to the District Attorney's Office for criminal review. We are adjourned. The gavel came down. I sat where I was for a moment after the noise came back. When I finally stood, Weston and Ingrid were already filing into the corridor with Sims. I passed them on the way to the elevator. Weston looked at me once, briefly. His expression was the one I had hoped not to see. Not remorse, not reckoning, but the particular relief of a person who has stopped anticipating the next bad thing. As though what had happened was something that had fallen on him, rather than something that had followed from his choices. Ingrid did not look at me at all. I kept walking. The criminal case moved faster than I expected. Tennessee's elder abuse statute treats financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult as a serious felony when the value involved is significant, and the evidence package Rowena's team delivered to the district attorney's office had the kind of organization that serious prosecutors don't have to build from. They just read what you've handed them. Ingrid was charged 6 weeks after the civil hearing, financial exploitation of an elderly person, document fraud, and fraudulent use of another party's professional credentials. The property value put it in the mandatory minimum category. Weston cooperated. He provided a detailed statement, was forthcoming about the timeline and the planning process, and received an arrangement reflecting that cooperation. 18 months of supervised probation, mandatory financial counseling, 250 hours of community service. The presiding judge noted on the record that his cooperation had been genuine, that his role, while not passive, had been secondary in direction and planning, and that the court nonetheless took the nature of the betrayal seriously. Ingrid received 3 years in state prison. I chose not to attend either sentencing. A letter from Weston arrived 5 weeks later, his handwriting on the envelope, the same slightly forward-leaning print he'd had since middle school. I held it before opening it. It was 6 pages. He wrote about the debt and the spiral of it, how each month's loss produced a decision that made the next month worse. He wrote that Ingrid had been the one who identified the plan, that he had told himself it would be temporary, that I would be well cared for. He wrote that he understood those were things he had needed to believe and not things that were true. He said he didn't know whether forgiveness was something I could offer, or whether it was even the right word for what he was asking. He said he was sorry. He wrote it more than once. I read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the desk drawer where I keep Florence's last letter, the one she wrote in her final weeks, the one I return to when I need to remember who she was and what we built together. I kept it because it says things I need to be reminded of. I wasn't sure yet what Weston's letter contained that I needed to keep, but I wasn't ready to put it somewhere I couldn't find it again. Some things take longer to resolve than you expect. That isn't a reason to stop trying. 6 weeks after the sentencing, I finished the rocking chair. I applied the final coat of finish on a Tuesday, let it cure through Thursday, and carried it out to the porch in the early morning before the heat came up. I set it where Florence had described, facing the water, angled slightly south to catch the afternoon light on the lake. I sat in it. The wood was warm from the morning sun, and the runners moved cleanly on the porch boards. Exactly the arc she had drawn in her notebook. The dimensions were right. The weight distribution was right. Everything balanced the way a thing balances when you have taken enough time to understand what it needs. The heron was at the point, patient and methodical, over the same stretch of shallows it had always preferred. 26 years on the bench taught me that fraud leaves tracks because people who plan these things are fundamentally careless about details. They take shortcuts. They assume the person they are working against is not paying close attention, has not spent decades learning to look at things carefully and ask what is actually being said versus what appears on the surface. What they never fully account for is the person who has made that kind of looking into a lifelong practice, who continues to do it not because it is still a profession, but because it has become the fundamental way of seeing the world. You don't retire from paying attention. You just stop writing the opinions. I brought my coffee out and sat in Florence's chair and watched the morning settle over the lake. And the water changed colors the way it does, and the heron worked the shallows without hurrying, and the chair held everything it was built to hold. That was enough for today.